the 16th of August 1942. The radar operators at the coastal listening station stared at the cathode screen in cold, paralyzed silence. 30 distinct blips were sweeping across the English Channel, an impenetrable wall of German Messerschmitts and Dornier bombers. Standing between that overwhelming armada and a vulnerable coastal city was not a fortified squadron of Spitfires. It was a single man, and worse, he was strapped into an aircraft the British Air Ministry had practically condemned as a flying coffin, a machine so structurally cursed that veteran pilots considered it a suicide pact just to prime the engine. This is the classified, buried account of Flight Lieutenant Thomas Callaghan, who took a condemned joke of an airplane and turned it into a terrifying legend. The English summer of 1942 was unforgivingly damp, wrapping the advanced airfield at RAF Manston in a perpetual, cold gray mist. Inside Hangar 4, away from the sleek, celebrated silhouettes of the Spitfires, sat a beast of an airplane that everyone on the base actively pretended did not exist. It was an early production model of the Hawker Typhoon, serial number R760. To the press, it was touted as the next evolution in British air superiority. To the men who actually had to fly it, it was a death sentence waiting to be signed. They called this particular airframe the guillotine. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Callaghan stood beneath the dripping corrugated tin roof of the hangar, a mug of tepid tea in his oil-stained hands, staring up at the monstrosity. Callaghan was a man who carried the heavy, quiet exhaustion of a pilot who had seen too much sky and lost too many friends. At 24, his face was already lined with the deep grooves of combat fatigue. He had survived the Battle of Britain in a battered hurricane, but a recent mid-air collision, one that was entirely out of his control, but for which he carried the crushing weight of survivor's guilt, had left him temporarily sidelined, grounded pending a psychological review. His only companion in the gloom was Sergeant William Pendleton, the base's chief mechanic, a man whose hands were permanently dyed black with engine grease. Pendleton was currently kicking the heavy, reinforced landing gear of the Typhoon with the toe of his steel-capped boot. "She's a bloody brick, Tommy," Pendleton muttered, wiping a streak of oil from his forehead. "I've tightened every rivet on the tail section, and I still wouldn't trust her in a steep dive." The Air Ministry must have been drunk on gin when they approved this draft. The Typhoon was designed around the revolutionary, massive, 2-4-cylinder Napier Sabre engine. It was supposed to make the plane the fastest thing in the sky. Instead, it made it a nightmare. The engine was notorious for spontaneously bursting into flames upon ignition. Worse, the exhaust fumes leaked directly into the cockpit, silently asphyxiating pilots before they even crossed the channel. And if that wasn't enough, in a high-speed dive, the immense torque and aerodynamic vibration had a horrifying tendency to shear the entire tail section completely off the fuselage. "It's heavily armed, William," Callaghan replied quietly, his eyes tracing the thick wings housing 4 20mm Hispano cannons. 1,200 rounds a minute. If you can keep her in the air, she hits like a freight train. "That's a massive if, mate," Pendleton scoffed. "Squadron leader Blakesley refuses to assign anyone to it. Last week, Peterson took her up for a test flight. Engine choked at 2,000 feet, cabin filled with carbon monoxide. He barely managed to crash land her in a cabbage field. Said he'd rather fight the Luftwaffe barehanded than get back in that cockpit." Callaghan nodded slowly. He knew the reputation. The Spitfire pilots mocked the Typhoon mercilessly. They called it the suicide sled. They joked that if you wanted to die for your country, there were cheaper ways than strapping yourself to a burning Napier engine. But Callaghan felt a strange, morbid kinship with the battered machine. They were both outcasts on the airfield. Callaghan, benched for a tragedy he couldn't prevent. The Typhoon, sidelined for engineering flaws it couldn't fix. He spent his grounded days helping Pendleton tinker with the engine, learning the specific, neurotic quirks of this exact airframe. He knew that the throttle stuck at 70%, that the left rudder pedal required a brutal kick to respond, and that if you kept the canopy cracked exactly 3 inches, the deadly carbon monoxide draft was blown out by the slipstream. "The Germans are shifting tactics," Callaghan murmured, staring at the dark, oil-slicked cowling. "They aren't just sending high-altitude bombers anymore. They're coming in low, fast. Hit-and-run sweeps right over the Communists. Spitfires are too delicate for that low-level brawling. They need something that can take a punch and hit back harder." "Well, this ain't it," Pendleton said firmly, slamming the heavy engine cowling shut. "Unless the plan is to drop this bloody anvil directly on a German's head, she's useless. Blakesley has ordered her stripped for parts by the end of the month." Callaghan didn't answer. He just reached out, his leather-gloved hand resting against the cold metal skin of the fuselage. Beneath his palm, the aircraft felt dead, hollowed out by the disdain of every man who had ever looked at it. But Callaghan knew the raw, ungodly power that rested inside that massive engine block. It was a chaotic, uncontrollable violence. And, as it turned out, chaotic violence was exactly what the day was about to demand. At 14 hours, the coastal fog finally broke, revealing a pale, watery sun. The airfield at Manston was largely quiet. 3 hours earlier, Squadron Leader Blakesley had led the entirety of the base's operational Spitfire Wings 24 aircraft on a massive intercept mission over the Strait of Dover, chasing what RAF Fighter Command believed to be a major offensive thrust. It was a brilliant, devastating feint by the Luftwaffe. At 14:15, the klaxons at Manston shrieked to life. It was a jarring, mechanical scream that cut through the lazy afternoon like a razor blade. Callaghan, who had been sitting in the dispersal hut reading a month-old newspaper, bolted upright. The door to the command hut banged open, and the base operations officer, a young, pale lieutenant named Harrison, ran out, his face completely drained of color. "Raid incoming," Harrison screamed, waving a piece of teletype paper. "Radar just picked them up, dropping below the radar shadow. It's a massive formation, 30 plus. They used the high-altitude group as a decoy to draw off Blakesley. This group is coming in right on the deck, heading straight for the radar installations at Dover and then the docks. ETA is less than 12 minutes. Callaghan ran to the map board. "Where is Blakesley?" 50 miles north and engaged. They can't break off." Harrison's voice cracked with panic. "We have nothing here. The reserve squadrons at Biggin Hill are scrambling, but they won't reach the coast in time. The radar array is completely exposed. If they knock it out, we're blind for the rest of the week." Callaghan looked out over the empty airfield. The grass strips were bare. Every serviceable fighter was gone. The only aircraft left were a trainer plane with no guns, a transport with a flat tire, and Callaghan's eyes locked onto Hangar 4. "Pendleton!" Callaghan roared, sprinting across the tarmac. The mechanic poked his head out of the hangar, a wrench in his hand. "Prime the guillotine. Now." Pendleton's jaw dropped. "Are you mad? She isn't flight cleared. The engine hasn't been properly tuned since Peterson crashed her. And she's got a cracked manifold. I don't care if she's held together with spit and baling wire, William," Callaghan shouted as he reached the hangar, snatching his parachute harness from a peg on the wall. "There are 30 German bombers and fighters about to wipe out our coastal defense, and we are the only thing standing between them and the target. Fuel her up. Strip the safety locks off the cannons. Tommy, listen to me." Pendleton grabbed Callaghan's arm, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "This isn't a Spitfire. You put that throttle to the firewall. She'll shake herself to pieces. The tail will snap. If the tail doesn't snap, the fumes will kill you before you see a single Jerry. It's suicide. It's suicide if I stay on the ground and let them bomb us into the Stone Age," Callaghan snapped, his voice turning to ice. He pulled his leather flying helmet over his head, snapping the chin strap. The exhaustion in his eyes was gone, replaced by a terrifying, hyper-focused clarity. "Get the starter cart." "That's an order, Sergeant." Pendleton hesitated for a fraction of a second before cursing loudly and sprinting toward the heavy, Wheeled starter accumulator. Callaghan climbed up the wing root, sliding into the cramped, notoriously uncomfortable cockpit of the Typhoon. It smelled of old oil, ozone, and the sour sweat of terrified men who had flown it before him. He ran through the pre-flight checks with frantic practice speed. Magnetos on, fuel cocks open, pitch set to fine. "Clear!" Pendleton yelled from below, plugging the starter cable into the side of the fuselage. Callaghan hit the ignition switch. For a terrifying moment, there was nothing but a sickening, grinding whine as the starter motor struggled to turn the massive 2-4-cylinder behemoth. Then, with a concussive bang that shook dust from the hangar roof, the Napier Sabre engine caught. A jet of orange flame shot 6 feet out of the exhaust stubs, blackening the side of the fuselage. The entire aircraft violently shuddered, bucking against its wheel chocks like a chained wild animal. Thick, acrid black smoke immediately filled the cockpit. Callaghan coughed, his eyes watering instantly. He grabbed the canopy handle, sliding it back exactly 3 inches, locking it into place. The slipstream of the propeller immediately sucked the worst of the smoke out, but the air remained bitter and toxic. "Chocks away!" Callaghan screamed over the deafening, bone-rattling roar of the engine. Pendleton yanked the wooden blocks from the wheels and dove out of the way. Callaghan pushed the throttle forward. The Typhoon didn't glide forward gracefully. It lunged. It lumbered out of the hangar, heavy and unwieldy, chewing up the grass of the runway. Callaghan fought the rudder pedals. The torque of the engine was trying to violently pull the plane to the right. He had to stand on the left rudder pedal with almost all his body weight just to keep her rolling straight. The end of the runway was approaching fast. The plane was too heavy, laden with full ammunition and fuel, and the engine was coughing, struggling to find its rhythm. "Come on, you ugly bastard," Callaghan prayed through gritted teeth, pulling back on the heavy control column. "Fly!" At the very last possible second, mere yards from the boundary fence, the heavy wheels lifted from the turf. The Typhoon sagged dangerously in the air, its belly almost scraping the perimeter hedge, before the massive engine finally caught its full, terrifying stride. Flight Lieutenant Tommy Callaghan was airborne. One rejected, suicidal fighter, flying out to meet 30 of the Luftwaffe's finest. The climb was an agonizing, physical battle. The Typhoon required constant, aggressive handling. Every minor adjustment of the stick required raw muscle. The engine roar was deafening, a mechanical scream that vibrated right through the soles of Callaghan's boots and up his spine. The cold air rushing through the cracked canopy was freezing his face, but he didn't dare close it. Even with the gap, he could taste the metallic tang of carbon monoxide at the back of his throat, making him slightly lightheaded. He stayed low, skimming the dark, churning waters of the English Channel at barely 500 feet. At this altitude, the radar wouldn't see him, but more importantly, neither would the Germans, until he was right on top of them. 10 miles out from the coast, he saw them. It looked like a swarm of angry locusts against the gray horizon. 30 aircraft, flying in a tight, disciplined V formation. As he closed the distance, the silhouettes sharpened into terrifying focus. The core of the formation consisted of 15 Dornier d'eau, 17 flying pencil bombers, their bomb bays loaded to the brim, heading straight for the radar stations. Shielding them, flying in a protective, stepped-up box formation, were 15 Messerschmitt Bf 109F fighters. Leading the fighter escort was Oberleutnant Heinrich Kessler, a seasoned veteran of the Luftwaffe, with 20 confirmed kills painted on the rudder of his Messerschmitt. From his elevated vantage point, Kessler scanned the sky. He expected a desperate, scrambling defense from Spitfires, dropping from the clouds. What he did not expect was a single, massive, unrecognizable aircraft, hurtling straight toward them, practically skimming the ocean waves. Kessler squinted through his gun sight, confused. The approaching plane lacked the elegant, elliptical wings of a Spitfire. It looked too thick, too brutal, almost like a deformed hurricane, but it was moving with a terrifying, unnatural speed. The massive Napier engine was pulling the Typhoon at nearly 400 miles per hour, closing the gap in seconds. In the cockpit of the Typhoon, Callaghan's heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The sheer scale of the enemy formation was paralyzing. 30-1. The mathematics of the encounter were fatal. There was no grand strategy here, no intricate dogfighting maneuvers to be had. If he tried to turn and dogfight the agile Messerschmitts, they would easily outmaneuver him and tear him to shreds. He had only one advantage: shock, and the sheer, devastating firepower of the 4 20mm cannons. "All right, you heavy brute," Callaghan whispered to the vibrating machine around him. "Let's see if you can take a punch." Instead of pulling up to engage the fighters, Callaghan slammed the throttle past the red line. The engine screamed in protest, a terrible rattling noise echoing from the front cowling. But the speed indicator ticked higher. He was going to fly straight through the center of the formation. A suicidal joust. Kessler, realizing the lone madman was not pulling away, shouted into his radio, "Achtung! Feindliches Flugzeug! Break formation and engage." But Callaghan was already too close, moving too fast. He aimed the heavy nose of the Typhoon directly at the lead element of the Dornier bombers. At 400 yards, Callaghan squeezed the firing button. The recoil of the 4 Hispano cannons was staggering. The entire aircraft juddered violently, bleeding speed as it unleashed a devastating storm of high-explosive shells. Callaghan didn't fire in bursts. He held the trigger down, spraying a solid wall of lead and fire directly into the path of the oncoming bombers. The result was catastrophic. The lead Dornier flew directly into the stream of 20mm shells. The cockpit shattered instantly in a spray of plexiglass and metal. The shells chewed through the fuselage, detonating the port engine. The bomber erupted in a brilliant, blinding fireball, violently pitching upward before snapping completely in half. Callaghan had less than a second to react. He hauled the heavy stick hard to the right, throwing the unwieldy Typhoon into a brutal bank to avoid colliding with the flaming wreckage. The G-force slammed him into his seat, the airframe groaning terribly, the sound of stressed metal shrieking in his ears. He flashed right through the center of the German formation, so close that he could see the terrified faces of the bomber gunners. They opened fire, tracer rounds streaking past his canopy like deadly green fireflies. Dozens of bullets pinged and hammered into the thick armored plating behind Callaghan's seat, sounding like hail on a tin roof. But the Typhoon's sheer bulk saved it. It absorbed the glancing hits and tore out the other side of the formation, its massive momentum carrying it safely away from the immediate crossfire. First blood went to the flying coffin. But as Callaghan leveled out, gasping for breath in the fume-filled cockpit, he looked in his rearview mirror. The element of surprise was gone. The Dorniers were tightening their formation, pushing onward toward the coast, and peeling off from the bomber stream, banking sharply with lethal, practiced precision, were 8 Messerschmitt 109s, led by Kessler. They were diving straight for him, hungry for the kill, ready to swat this solitary, lumbering nuisance out of the sky. Callaghan wiped the sweat from his eyes, gripping the heavy control column as the Napier engine sputtered ominously before catching again. He was alone, flying a broken machine against the elite of the Luftwaffe, and the real fight hadn't even started yet. The English Channel blurred into a slate-gray smear beneath Callaghan's wings. He was flying at 0 feet so low that the slipstream from his massive 4-bladed propeller was kicking up a white wake of sea spray behind him. Behind him, Oberleutnant Heinrich Kessler and 7 Messerschmitt Bf 109Fs were descending like a pack of starved wolves. Kessler pushed his stick forward, the sleek, aerodynamic nose of his 109 dropping effortlessly into the pursuit. He expected to close the distance in seconds. The standard British fighter, the Spitfire, was a dancer at 1, fights by turning tighter and outmaneuvering its opponent. But this strange, thick-winged brute wasn't dancing. It was running. To Kessler's absolute astonishment, the distance between his fighters and the British lone wolf wasn't shrinking. It was growing. Weber, Brandt, "Bracket him," Kessler barked into his throat microphone, his frustration bleeding through the static. "Push your throttles to the firewall. Do not let him reach the coast." Inside the Typhoon's cockpit, Callaghan was fighting a war on two fronts. The first was the Luftwaffe behind him. The second was the machine trying to kill him from the inside. The Napier Sabre engine was a marvel of destructive engineering, capable of generating over 2,000 horsepower. Down here, at sea level, the air was thick, feeding the 24 cylinders exactly what they needed. The airspeed indicator was vibrating past 390 miles per hour. No German fighter in the sky could catch a Typhoon on the deck in a straight line. But the cost was agonizing. The cockpit temperature had spiked to over 100 degrees. The engine coolant temperature gauge was pinned in the red, the needle vibrating frantically. The cracked canopy, meant to vent the carbon monoxide, was instead creating a howling vortex of freezing ocean air that whipped around his neck, clashing violently with the suffocating heat, baking his boots. His head throbbed with the dull, rhythmic ache of early-stage carbon monoxide poisoning. Tunnel vision was threatening the edges of his sight. "Hold together, you miserable bastard," Callaghan prayed, his gloved hands gripping the heavy control column with white-knuckled desperation. Every minor adjustment required the strength of a weightlifter. The Typhoon didn't want to fly. It wanted to plow into the ocean. He glanced in his brass rearview mirror. Two Messerschmitts, piloted by Weber and Brandt, had broken off from the main pack, diving at a shallower angle to build up kinetic energy. They were creeping up on his port and starboard quarters, attempting to catch him in a crossfire. Tracers suddenly whipped past Callaghan's left wing, bright green lines of sudden death carving through the damp air. Callaghan couldn't outturn them. If he banked, he would bleed speed, and the 109S would rip him to shreds in the turn. He had to do something completely irrational. Callaghan waited until the tracers from Weber's 109 were walking dangerously close to his port aileron. Then, with a savage yell, he didn't pull away. He slammed the throttle completely shut and stomped on the right rudder pedal with all his remaining strength, pulling the heavy stick back into his stomach. It was a violent, uncoordinated skidding maneuver that would have ripped the wings off a lighter aircraft. The Typhoon screamed in structural agony. The sudden, brutal deceleration was like hitting a brick wall in midair. Callaghan was thrown violently forward, against his harness, the straps biting brutally into his collarbones. Lieutenant Weber, expecting the British plane to maintain its desperate sprint, had nowhere to go. Flying at nearly 400 miles per hour, the German pilot blew right past the decelerating Typhoon, overshooting his target in a heartbeat. Suddenly, the hunter was the hunted. Callaghan slammed the throttle forward again. The Napier engine choked, backfired with a concussive boom that sent a shockwave of soot into the cockpit, and then roared back to life. Callaghan hauled the nose up, wrestling the heavy gun sight onto the exhaust trails of Weber's fleeing Messerschmitt. He squeezed the firing button. The 4 Hispano cannons barked, a rapid-fire thudding that shook the fillings in Callaghan's teeth. The heavy 20mm high-explosive shells didn't just hit Weber's 109. They dismantled it. The entire tail section of the Messerschmitt disintegrated into a cloud of shredded aluminum and burning fabric. The German fighter pitched violently forward, snapping into a deadly, uncontrollable spin before plunging nose first into the churning waters of the Channel. 1 down, 6 to go, plus 15 bombers. But Callaghan didn't have time to celebrate. The violent maneuver had bled off his precious speed, and the rest of Kessler's pack was now directly above him, rolling inverted to drop in for the kill. "He is slow! Hit him now!" Kessler roared, lining up his Revy gun sight on the broad, olive-drab wings of the Typhoon. A hail of 7.92 millimeters machine gun fire and 20 millimeters cannon shells rained down on Callaghan. The noise was terrifying, a deafening drum roll of metal tearing into metal. The Typhoon shuddered under the impacts. Sparks showered the cockpit as a bullet deflected off the thick armor plating behind his headrest. The port wing took a burst of cannon fire, tearing a jagged hole the size of a dinner plate through the aluminum skin. A Spitfire would have been mortally wounded, its delicate framework shattered. But the Typhoon was built like a flying tank. Its reinforced spar held. Callaghan shoved the stick forward, pushing the nose down until he was practically flying through the crests of the waves, trying to make himself an impossible target. But the odds were catching up. The engine was coughing, spitting black oil across the armored windscreen, obscuring his vision. Through the smeared glass, a terrifying sight loomed on the horizon. Rising from the gray mist were the stark, imposing chalk walls of the white cliffs of Dover. And directly above them, banking gently to align their payload, were the 14 remaining Dornier bombers. They had reached the coast, the towering radar pylons. The very eyes of Britain's coastal defense were sitting defenseless in their crosshairs. Callaghan realized with a sinking, cold certainty that dogfighting the Messerschmitts was a fatal distraction. If he stayed and fought Kessler, the bombers would flatten the radar stations. The entire southern sector would go blind, leaving London wide open for the night raids. He had to get to those bombers, even if it meant ignoring the 6 furious fighters on his tail. "Forget the fighters," Callaghan muttered aloud, his voice raspy from the toxic fumes. He reached up, blindly wiping a smear of engine grease from his goggles. Just get to the bombers. He pushed the throttle past the emergency gate, breaking the safety wire. It was a measure designed to give the pilot an extra boost of manifold pressure for no more than 3 minutes. Any longer, and the engine was guaranteed to melt itself into slag. The Typhoon surged forward with a terrifying, primal roar. The airframe began to vibrate so violently that the dials on the instrument panel blurred into unreadable white circles. Callaghan hauled back on the stick, pulling the heavy fighter into a steep, agonizing climb directly toward the bomber formation. Behind him, Kessler watched in disbelief. "What is this madman doing?" Kessler thought. The British pilot was completely ignoring them, offering his 6 o'clock position on a silver platter just to gain altitude. "All units, concentrate fire on his tail," Kessler commanded, opening up with his own nose-mounted cannon. The Typhoon was taking a horrific beating. Tracers chewed into the rudder. The port elevator was shot to ribbons, flapping uselessly in the slipstream. Inside the cockpit, the noise of the impacts was deafening. Callaghan gritted his teeth, his arms trembling violently as he fought the aerodynamic drag of his crippled tail. Every instinct screamed at him to evade, to roll away from the relentless hammering of Kessler's guns. But he held the stick rigid, his eyes locked on the leading V formation of the Dorniers. He was climbing right into their defensive crossfire. The rear gunners of the Dorniers spotted the lone, smoking, battered beast rising from the ocean. 14 bombers, each bristling with MG-15 machine guns, swiveled their mounts. A solid wall of lead poured downward. Callaghan was flying into a meat grinder. The sky around him crisscrossed with blinding tracer fire from both the bombers above and the fighters below. A bullet shattered the starboard side of his canopy, filling the cockpit with a blizzard of sharp plexiglass shards. One shard sliced across Callaghan's cheek, hot blood instantly welling up and smearing across his chin. He didn't flinch. His vision was tunneling, his lungs screaming for clean oxygen, his hands slick with sweat and blood, but his mind was chillingly clear. Lead aircraft, he told himself, focusing entirely on the Dornier, at the very apex of the formation. Take the leader, break the chain. At 300 yards, climbing vertically and stalling fast, Callaghan pulled the trigger. The 4 Hispanos roared, dumping their remaining ammunition in a continuous, uninterrupted stream of pure destruction. Callaghan didn't aim at the fuselage. He walked his fire directly across the starboard wing of the lead Dornier. The high explosive shells walked a line of fiery explosions across the bomber's wing spar. The structural integrity failed instantly. The right wing of the command Dornier sheared completely off, folding backward like a broken bird. The massive bomber flipped violently to the right, crashing heavily into the wingman, flying tightly beside it. It was a catastrophic chain reaction. The 2 massive bombers tangled together, in a horrific embrace of tearing metal and erupting fuel, dropping out of the sky in a blinding, expanding fireball. The sudden, brutal destruction of their flight leader sent a shockwave of panic through the remaining German bomber crews. The strict, disciplined V formation instantly dissolved into chaos. Bombers aggressively banked left and right to avoid the falling wreckage of their commanders. Down below, the radar operators at Dover, who had been bracing for imminent death, watched the radar scopes in stunned disbelief as the tightly packed swarm of blips suddenly scattered like a broken rack of billiard balls. Without their lead navigator, and terrified of mid-air collisions in the sudden panic, the Dorniers began prematurely jettisoning their bomb loads over the empty channel to gain speed for their escape. Callaghan had done it. He had broken the raid. But the price was extracted immediately. As Callaghan crested his climb, his momentum died. The Typhoon, bleeding speed and riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, stalled out at 6,000 feet. The engine, having been pushed past the red line for far too long, finally gave out. With a sickening, metallic screech that vibrated through the floorboards, the massive Napier saber seized. Black smoke instantly poured from the cowling, thick and choking. The propeller stopped dead. The sudden silence in the cockpit was terrifying, broken only by the howl of the wind rushing through the shattered canopy and the groaning of stressed metal. The Typhoon dropped its heavy nose and began to fall like a stone. Callaghan slumped against his harness, gasping for air, his vision swimming in dark, swirling patches. His left arm was numb, a dark patch of blood spreading across the shoulder of his flight jacket, where a piece of shrapnel had bitten deep. He reached for the canopy release handle with his right hand, preparing to bail out, but the handle wouldn't budge. The frame of the canopy had been twisted by the structural stress of the dive and the bullet impacts. He was trapped inside a falling, burning coffin of iron, and as the earth rushed up to meet him, he looked out the shattered side window. Oberleutnant Kessler's Messerschmitt pulled up smoothly alongside the falling Typhoon, matching its descent. The German ace looked across the short distance, staring at the battered, bloodied British pilot trapped inside the smoking wreck. Kessler's finger rested on the firing button, ready to deliver the final, merciful burst that would end the impossible resistance of this lone madman. The altimeter unwound with terrifying speed. 5,000 feet, 4,000. The English Channel rushed upward, a cold, gray slab of concrete waiting to shatter the falling iron. Inside the smoke-filled cockpit, Flight Lieutenant Tommy Callaghan fought a losing battle against the jammed canopy. He battered his heavy, leather-clad elbow against the perspex, but the reinforced frame, warped by the brutal G-forces and cannon impacts, refused to yield. His left arm hung uselessly at his side. The shrapnel wound, pulsing with a hot, sickening rhythm. He was trapped. He stopped struggling, slumping back against the armored seat. The wind shrieked through the bullet holes in the fuselage, playing a chaotic, mournful dirge. He turned his head to the right, looking through the blood-smeared glass. Oberleutnant Heinrich Kessler was still there. The sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109F was flying in tight formation, merely 30 feet off Callaghan's starboard wing. Kessler's canopy was crystal clear. Callaghan could see the German pilot's face, obscured by his oxygen mask and dark goggles, staring intently at the ruined Typhoon. Callaghan knew the unwritten, ruthless mathematics of aerial warfare. He had just decimated Kessler's bomber escort and vaporized one of his wingmen. Vengeance was not just expected, it was mandatory. Callaghan waited for the bright, lethal flash of the Messerschmitt's nose cannon. He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow, accepting the inevitable end of the Widowmaker and its pilot. Seconds ticked by. The altimeter slipped past 2,000 feet. Nothing happened. Callaghan opened his eyes. Kessler hadn't fired. Instead, the German ace was staring at the catastrophic damage inflicted upon the British fighter. The Typhoon's tail was practically a skeletal framework of shredded aluminum. The port wing was riddled with holes, large enough to put a fist through. The massive engine block was spewing a thick, oily death shroud, and inside, a single, battered man was trapped, riding a doomed brick toward the earth. To Kessler, shooting down this falling, defenseless wreck would not be a victory. It would be an execution. In the brutal, unforgiving skies of 1942, a strange, fleeting moment of absolute professional respect transcended the uniforms they wore. Kessler recognized what this lone pilot had just accomplished. One man had broken an entire Luftwaffe raid through sheer, suicidal audacity. Through the perspex, Kessler locked eyes with Callaghan. The German slowly, deliberately raised his right hand in a crisp, two-fingered salute. Callaghan, stunned, barely managed a weak nod in return. With a sharp kick of rudder, Kessler banked his Messerschmitt away, pulling up in a steep climbing turn to rejoin the fleeing remnants of his scattered squadron, leaving the doomed British pilot to the mercy of gravity and the earth. Callaghan was alone again. The altimeter read 800 feet. The coastline was rushing beneath him, the jagged, chalky precipice of the Dover cliffs, giving way to a patchwork of green, sloping fields and marshland. "All right, you heavy brute," Callaghan whispered, his right hand gripping the dead control column. His voice was raw, his throat scorched by the engine fire. "He gave us a pass. Now you give me one." The Hawker Typhoon had the glide ratio of a falling anvil, without the immense power of the Napier Sabre engine pushing air over the thick wings. The controls felt as if they were set in wet cement. Callaghan had to use every ounce of remaining strength in his right arm, and both legs, to keep the nose from dropping into an irrecoverable vertical dive. He spotted a long, flat stretch of muddy cabbage field bordering a stone wall, roughly 2 miles inland from the radar arrays he had just saved. He didn't touch the landing gear lever. Dropping the wheels would create fatal drag, and hitting the soft, furrowed earth with the undercarriage down would cause the heavy aircraft to instantly flip, snapping his neck. It had to be a belly landing. "Hold together," Callaghan prayed, his knuckles turning white as he wrestled the heavy stick, aligning the smoking nose with the furrows of the field. "Just hold together for 10 more seconds." 50 feet. The ground was a blurring canvas of green and brown. 10 feet. He hauled the stick back into his stomach, flaring the heavy aircraft to bleed off the last 50 miles per hour of airspeed. The silence of the dead engine was suddenly replaced by the deafening, catastrophic roar of impact. The altimeter was a shattered, useless dial, its glass face cracked into a spiderweb of white lines. But Callaghan didn't need an instrument to tell him the end was seconds away. The English countryside was no longer a picturesque quilt of green and brown. It was a rapidly accelerating blur of fatal velocity. The Hawker Typhoon had the glide ratio of a dropped anvil, without the immense, brutal horsepower of the Napier Sabre engine, pushing turbulent air over those thick wings. The flight controls felt as though they had been submerged in setting concrete. Callaghan was fighting with every ounce of his remaining strength, his right arm trembling violently as he hauled back on the heavy control column. His left arm was completely unresponsive, pinned against his side by a combination of shock and the agonizing, pulsing fire of a shrapnel wound. Directly ahead lay a sprawling, muddy cabbage field bordering a low stone wall, roughly 2 miles inland from the towering Dover radar arrays he had just saved. "Hold together," Callaghan rasped, the words tasting of blood and engine soot. "Just hold together for 10 more seconds." He didn't dare touch the landing gear lever. Dropping the heavy wheels now would create a catastrophic drag that would instantly stall the aircraft, dropping it like a stone. Worse, if the undercarriage hit the soft, rain-soaked furrows of the Kentish field at this speed, the heavy aircraft would violently somersault, instantly snapping his neck and crushing the cockpit flat. It had to be a belly landing, a controlled crash. 50 feet, the ground effect, a cushion of air that usually built up beneath the wings of an aircraft right before touchdown, was practically non-existent due to the Typhoon's aerodynamic damage and dead weight. 20 feet. 10. Callaghan hauled the stick back into his stomach with a guttural scream, desperately flaring the heavy aircraft to bleed off the last 50 miles per hour of airspeed. He braced his boots against the rudder pedals and pressed his helmet hard against the armored headrest. The silence of the dead engine was suddenly obliterated by the deafening, apocalyptic roar of impact. The heavy brass chin radiator of the Typhoon struck the Earth first at over 120 miles per hour. The deceleration was unimaginably violent, a localized earthquake that tore a massive trench through the damp soil. A colossal geyser of dark earth, water, and shredded vegetation erupted into the air, completely swallowing the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, the G-force was monstrous. Callaghan was thrown fiercely forward against his shoulder harness. The thick canvas webbing bit into his collarbones with bone-bruising force, saving him from being launched through the armored windscreen, but his head violently whipped forward. His leather flying helmet smashed brutally against the heavy brass ring of the Reeve gun sight. The world exploded into a blinding, searing flash of white light, followed instantly by a crushing darkness. Outside, the Typhoon acted like a 24-foot plowshare, driven by the hand of a furious god. The massive, heavily criticized Napier Sabre engine, the very engineering nightmare that had made the plane a laughingstock, now became Callaghan's ultimate salvation. The sheer, indestructible bulk of the 2,000-pound engine block absorbed the vast majority of the kinetic energy. Instead of the engine folding backward and crushing the pilot, as it did in lighter fighters, the Napier acted as a battering ram, bulldozing tons of earth out of the way. Metal shrieked in agonizing protest. The remaining section of the starboard wing caught on a hidden, submerged stone drainage berm. The immense leverage violently spun the fuselage in a brutal, 300-degree flat ground loop. The tail section, already chewed to ribbons by Oberleutnant Kessler's cannons, finally surrendered. It sheared completely off, tumbling away like a discarded toy. Mud and heavy debris violently battered the sides of the remaining monocoque fuselage, burying the shattered canopy in a suffocating, lightless wave of wet dirt. And then, abruptly, the violent motion ceased. The silence that settled over the field was absolute, heavy, and ringing. It was the distinct, terrifying quiet of a fresh grave. For a long time, nothing moved in the furrowed trench, save for the hiss of steam. The boiling engine coolant was bleeding from severed lines, dropping onto the hot exhaust stubs and the damp earth. But beneath the smell of overturned soil and burnt oil, a far more sinister scent began to pool in the low ground. The sharp, volatile stench of 100 octane aviation spirit. The main fuel tanks and the wing roots had ruptured. Deep inside the crushed, buried cockpit, Thomas Callaghan's consciousness slowly clawed its way back from the dark. His first sensation was the taste of copper and mud. His second was the terrifying realization that he was entirely blind. Panic, cold and primal, spiked in his chest. He blinked rapidly, his eyelashes scraping against a thick, heavy layer of wet earth that had been forced through the shattered side panels of the Perspex canopy. He raised his right hand, his fingers trembling and slick with his own blood, and wiped the mud from his goggles. A faint, pale light filtered through the dirt-caked canopy above him. He wasn't blind. He was buried. "Get out!" his brain screamed. "Fire! Get out now!" He reached blindly for the red canopy release handle above his right shoulder. He found the cold metal, gripped it, and pulled. It didn't budge. He pulled harder, his biceps screaming in protest. Nothing. The immense structural torsion of the crash, combined with the earlier barrage of 20mm cannon shells, had warped the heavy steel track of the canopy. It was completely fused. He was sealed inside a coffin of twisted aluminum, sitting directly atop a growing puddle of highly explosive aviation fuel. If a single spark from the cooling engine block caught the fumes, the entire wreckage would detonate in a fireball that would leave nothing but ashes. He hammered his right fist against the reinforced perspex until his knuckles bled, but the heavy glass, though cracked, refused to shatter. Exhaustion, profound and absolute, finally overtook his panic. Callaghan slumped back against the armored seat, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a symphony of agonizing pain. His left collarbone was definitely broken, and the shrapnel wound in his shoulder throbbed with a sickly heat. "I kept them away," he thought, his mind beginning to drift back toward the comforting dark. "The towers are safe. Blakesley can handle the rest." He closed his eyes, ready to let the cold English mud claim him. Half a mile away, a clattering, smoke-belching Bedford truck belonging to the local home guard skidded violently to a halt on a narrow dirt lane bordering the cabbage field. 14-year-old Samuel Collins, a local farm boy who had been poaching rabbits in the adjacent woods, had seen the lone aircraft fall from the sky and sprinted all the way to the village pub to raise the alarm. Now, half a dozen men piled out of the back of the truck, armed with a mismatched assortment of Lee-Enfield rifles, heavy iron crowbars, and pitchforks. They were led by Sergeant William Miller, a grizzled, no-nonsense veteran who had survived the mud and poison gas of the Somme 25 years earlier. Miller took one look at the massive, smoldering trench cutting across the field and chambered a round into his rifle. "Spread out. Keep your weapons trained on the wreckage," Miller barked, his boots sinking into the wet mud as he advanced. "Samuel, you stay back by the truck. If anyone comes out of that crater shooting, you run for the constable." The squad approached the wreckage with terrified caution. The aircraft sitting at the end of the trench was completely unrecognizable. It was a massive, deformed lump of mud, scorched metal, and leaking fluids. It possessed none of the elegant, familiar curves of a Supermarine Spitfire, or the recognizable hump of a Hawker Hurricane. "Look at the size of that engine block, Sergeant," whispered Corporal Jenkins, his rifle trembling as he aimed at the ruined cockpit. "It's too bloody big for ours. You think it's one of those new Focke-Wulfs the Jerrys are flying?" "I don't know what the hell it is," Miller muttered, his eyes narrowing as he caught the overwhelming, terrifying scent of raw aviation fuel. "But if there's a German in there, he's either dead or wishing he was." Miller scrambled cautiously up onto the slippery, angled root of the port wing. The metal groaned ominously under his weight. He reached the cockpit, which was almost entirely obscured by a thick, hardened layer of topsoil. Using the sleeve of his heavy wool tunic, Miller vigorously wiped a section of the perspex clean. He peered into the gloom. Sitting amidst a chaotic, terrifying tangle of smashed instrument dials, severed hydraulic lines, and shattered glass, a pilot slowly turned his head. The man's face was a horrific mask of dried blood, black engine soot, and pale, chalky mud. But beneath the grime, strapped to the pilot's chest, Miller saw the unmistakable, faded blue fabric of an RAF May West Life Preserver. "Lower your weapons," Miller roared, dropping his rifle onto the wing and frantically grabbing the edges of the canopy. "He's one of ours! Bloody hell! It's an RAF boy! Get up here, Jenkins! Bring the irons!" Jenkins scrambled up the wing, thrusting a heavy steel crowbar into Miller's hands. Inside the cockpit, Callaghan looked up at his rescuers. His lips moved, but the thick perspex muffled his words. "The track is warped, Sergeant," Jenkins yelled over the hiss of the cooling engine. "It's jammed tight." "We have to pry it," Miller shouted back. "The whole bloody thing is soaking in petrol. One spark from this iron, and we all go up in flames. Slow and steady, on 3. Miller jammed the flat end of the crowbar into the microscopic gap between the canopy frame and the fuselage. 1, 2, 3. Heave. Both men threw their entire body weight against the steel bar. The metal groaned, screeching in high-pitched protest. A terrifying shower of rust and dried mud fell into the cockpit, but the frame didn't yield. "Again!" Miller roared, his face turning purple with exertion. "Push, damn you!" With a loud, violent crack that sounded like a rifle shot, the warped locking mechanism shattered. The heavy canopy suddenly broke free, sliding backward on its mangled rails. A rush of cold, clean, salty coastal air instantly flooded the toxic cockpit. Thomas Callaghan took a ragged, desperate breath, his lungs expanding painfully as they finally took in oxygen instead of cordite and carbon monoxide. It was the purest, sweetest thing he had ever tasted in his life. "Easy now, lad," Miller said softly, his gruff voice cracking with emotion as he reached into the ruined cockpit. He carefully slid his hands under Callaghan's uninjured right arm. "We've got you. You're back on the ground. You're safe. Watch his left side, Sergeant. His shoulder's torn up bad," Jenkins warned, helping to support the pilot's weight as they painstakingly hoisted him out of the iron tomb. They dragged Callaghan down the slippery wing and laid him gently on the damp, cool grass, a safe distance from the leaking fuel. Callaghan didn't look up at the gray sky, nor did he look at the medics who were rushing over from the truck with a canvas stretcher and a medical kit. Instead, Callaghan weakly forced his head to the side, looking back at the ruined, smoking hulk of Hawker Typhoon R760, the Widowmaker, the flying coffin, the despised, grounded joke of the Royal Air Force. It was utterly, completely destroyed. The fuselage was bent in half, the wings were stripped to their spars, and the cursed Napier engine was a smoking pile of cracked iron buried in the mud. But the heavy brute had taken the absolute worst the Luftwaffe and the Earth could throw at it, and it had kept its pilot alive. Callaghan then forced his gaze past the wreckage, looking toward the distant coastline. There, standing tall and unbothered against the clearing afternoon sky, the skeletal pylons of the Dover radar array were still rotating in slow, methodical circles. Callaghan reached up with his bloodied right hand, weakly clutching the lapel of Sergeant Miller's tunic. His grip was surprisingly strong for a dying man. "The radar," Callaghan rasped, his voice barely a hollow whisper. How many bombers got through?" Miller looked down at the young, broken pilot, a look of profound awe and deep, respectful silence settling over his weathered features. The older veteran gently placed his hand over Callaghan's. "None of them, lad," Miller answered quietly, his voice thick with unshed tears. The coast watchers saw the whole bloody thing. The bombers panicked. They dropped their loads straight into the drink and ran for France like frightened dogs. "The sky is completely clear." Callaghan stared at Miller for a long moment, processing the words. The crushing weight of the day, the impossible odds, the sheer terror of the dogfight, it all finally began to evaporate. A faint, exhausted smile cracked the dried mud and blood on Callaghan's cheek. He released Miller's tunic, letting his hand fall away, and allowed his head to sink back onto the damp, comforting earth. "Good," Callaghan whispered to the empty air. "That's good." He closed his eyes, and as the medics finally reached him, the lone defender of the coast let the darkness take him, knowing the impossible sortie was finally over. The legend of the Widowmaker changed on the afternoon of the 16th of August, 1942. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Callaghan's desperate, solo interception forced the British Air Ministry to entirely reevaluate the Hawker Typhoon. While it was a clumsy, dangerous failure as a high-altitude dogfighter, Callaghan had inadvertently proven its true, devastating purpose. By utilizing its unmatched low-altitude speed, terrifying structural durability, and heavy cannon armament, the RAF realized they possessed the ultimate low-level interceptor. Callaghan survived his injuries and returned to flight status 8 months later, leading one of the first dedicated Typhoon ground attack squadrons. The aircraft that pilots once refused to fly became the most feared ground attack fighter of the war, instrumental in shattering German armor at the Falaise Pocket in 1944. It was an evolution born not in a safe engineering lab, but in the bloody, smoke-filled cockpit of a condemned machine, piloted by a man who simply refused to die.